By March 9th, 2026, 10 days after the February 28th attacks that set off the current war around Iran, the crisis was already spilling far beyond the battlefield. Tanker traffic through the Strait of Hormuz had nearly frozen. Iraqi oil production had collapsed by roughly 70%. A war that began with strikes and retaliation was already turning into an economic shock for the whole region. But the deeper problem did not begin this month. It began decades earlier, when one leader in Baghdad looked at chaos across the border and thought he saw the perfect moment to act. In September 1980, Saddam Hussein believed revolutionary Iran was weak enough to break, vulnerable enough to intimidate, and divided enough to lose a short war. He thought one fast decision could strengthen Iraq, humble Tehran, and redraw the balance of power in the Gulf. Instead, that choice helped build a pattern of fear, militarization, proxy influence, and oil insecurity that the Middle East is still living inside now. So how did one invasion meant to create control end up creating a crisis logic the region still cannot escape? Let's join Rooms Where History and find out what that turning point decision was, how it changed the map, and what it still costs the Middle East today. Saddam Hussein did not drift into this war. He chose it. And he chose it because the regional system had suddenly become unstable in a way ambitious rulers often find irresistible. In 1979, the Iranian Revolution overthrew the Shah, and Ruhollah Khomeini returned to Tehran on February 1st to lead a new Islamic order. From Baghdad, that did not look like a neighboring state merely changing governments. It looked like a strategic earthquake. A pro-Western monarchy had fallen. A revolutionary regime had risen. Its institutions were still being formed. Its chain of command was unsettled. Its rhetoric was ideological, confrontational, and impossible for surrounding capitals to ignore. Saddam looked at that turbulence and did not see only danger. He saw timing. If Iran recovered, Iraq would face a stronger and more confident rival. If Iraq moved early, it might shape the next order before Tehran could. That was the beginning of the logic. Not patience, not containment, but preemption dressed as opportunity. To understand why Saddam moved, the story has to stay tight around the decision-maker. He had three overlapping motives. First, there was the old dispute over the Shatt al-Arab, the waterway tied to sovereignty, shipping, and prestige. The 1975 Algiers Agreement had forced Iraq to accept the Thalweg line as the maritime boundary, and Baghdad never truly liked that settlement. Second, there was oil and territory, especially the attraction of Khuzestan, Iran's oil-rich southwestern province. Third, and most important, there was the wider balance of power. Saddam did not want Iraq boxed in by a revolutionary state next door that might stabilize, radicalize, and project influence outward. In his reading, Iran's revolution created both a threat and a window. Threats demand preparation. Windows tempt action. When those two things appear at the same time, leaders start convincing themselves that delay is the real danger. That is where Saddam's calculation hardened. He was no longer asking whether the border was tense. He was asking whether history had opened a short-lived chance to revise the whole regional hierarchy. That calculation depended on a single core assumption, that revolutionary disorder meant lasting weakness. And in 1979 and 1980, that assumption did not look absurd from the outside. Iran was replacing institutions, purging rivals, and struggling to convert revolutionary energy into stable state control. The armed forces inherited from the Shah were under suspicion. Political authority was being redistributed. New structures were emerging, including the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, formed in 1979 to protect the revolution and counter threats to the new order. From Baghdad, that looked like fragmentation. But there is a trap here that history repeats often. A state in upheaval can look weaker than it really is, because outsiders mistake reorganization for collapse. Saddam saw competing centers of power, a disrupted military, and ideological turmoil. He concluded Iran would not be able to absorb a major blow. What he did not fully account for was that invasion itself could become the force that fused the new regime together faster. He thought he was striking before Iran hardened. In reality, he was about to help harden it. Then the reading became a decision. In September 1980, Saddam announced that Iraq was abrogating the Algiers Agreement, arguing that Iran had violated it. Soon after, on September 22, 1980, open warfare began when Iraqi forces invaded western Iran. This is the hinge of the whole episode. The invasion was not a theatrical impulse. It came out of closed leadership calculations in Baghdad, military planning, and a belief that speed could compensate for risk. Saddam thought a short war could achieve several things at once: revise the border, pressure Khuzestan, weaken Khomeini's regime, and elevate Iraq's position in the Gulf. It was a classic short war theory: move first, create shock, gain ground, and force the opponent to negotiate from weakness. These theories often sound clean before the first real resistance appears. They promise quick leverage, manageable escalation, and a controlled outcome. But once the decision crosses the border, control starts shrinking. What matters then is not only what the attacker intends, but how the target adapts. Saddam committed Iraq to war, believing adaptation would come too late. That judgment would define everything that followed. At first, the plan seemed to have momentum. Iraqi forces advanced into Khuzestan, captured Khorramshahr, and threatened key areas, while Iran was taken by surprise. But the offensive failed to deliver the decisive collapse Baghdad wanted. Iraqi troops could not take the important refining center at Abadan, and by December 1980, the advance had bogged down inside Iran after much stronger resistance than expected. That shift matters because it exposed the first major flaw in Saddam's decision. He had counted on Iranian weakness as a fixed condition. It turned out to be temporary and incomplete. Iraq could seize ground. It could not translate early movement into strategic closure. And once the first wave stalled, the war changed character. It stopped looking like a quick correction of the border and started becoming a grinding test of endurance. That was the moment the invasion stopped being a clean strategic instrument and started becoming a machine of consequences. Saddam had opened the war to gain leverage. Instead, he had enlarged the battlefield faster than he had enlarged Iraq's control. What saved Iran in that first phase was not the absence of weakness, but the speed with which weakness was converted into mobilization. Iraq's invasion gave Tehran something revolutionary regimes often need in order to solidify: an external enemy large enough to unify fragmented power centers. The regular army did not disappear. The new leadership did not simply implode. And the IRGC, which began as a revolutionary force guarding the new order, gained stature through combat. Britannica notes that its zeal and battlefield performance helped transform it from a limited militia into one of the central armed institutions of the Islamic Republic. Saddam had wanted to interrupt consolidation. He ended up accelerating it. That is one of the central trade-offs in the story. From Baghdad's perspective, invasion was meant to reduce long-term danger by exploiting short-term weakness. From Tehran's perspective, invasion became the emergency that turned instability into national and ideological cohesion. History often works this way. The same action that seems to solve one side's strategic fear can solve the other side's political weakness. Once that happened, the war stopped being a raid into uncertainty and became a struggle over survival, legitimacy, and time. This is where the episode needs precision. It is easy to look back and treat Saddam's gamble as obviously irrational. It was not obviously irrational in the narrow sense. Iran really was in upheaval. Command chains really were unsettled. Revolutionary politics really did alarm Iraq and other regional states. Leaders do not act on perfect information. They act on windows they believe are closing. Saddam's logic was recognizable. Strike before the neighboring revolution matures, recover leverage over contested water and border issues, and assert Iraq's rank before the balance of power hardens against you. That logic was legible. The problem was not that it lacked internal coherence. The problem was that it misjudged how the target would react once attacked. Strategic logic can be clear and still fail catastrophically if it underestimates adaptation. That is what makes this a turning point decision rather than just a military event. The invasion did not fail because Saddam had no logic. It failed because his logic did not survive contact with Iranian resilience, wartime mobilization, and the political effect of being invaded. By 1981 and especially 1982, the tide had turned. Iranian forces pushed Iraqi troops back across key fronts, and in May 1982 they recaptured Khorramshahr. Iraq soon withdrew from all captured Iranian territory and began seeking a peace agreement. That was a critical moment because the original logic of Saddam's decision had now broken down. The quick war had failed. The border had not been decisively revised. Khomeini's regime had not collapsed. Iraq had not remade the Gulf Order. Yet the conflict did not end there. And that is where this story becomes more than a portrait of Saddam's mistake. Once Iran had reversed the battlefield balance, Tehran faced its own decision: stop after restoring territory or continue in pursuit of a larger outcome. Khomeini chose to continue the war, seeing Saddam as an obstacle to the revolution and refusing a settlement that left him in place. That choice did not erase the importance of Saddam's original invasion. It deepened its consequences. One leader started the furnace. The other refused to let it cool once the original injury had been reversed. That second choice matters because it shows why the best analysis of this war is not moral theater, but trade-off analysis. Once Iran had regained the initiative, stopping would have meant accepting vast losses without removing the man who had started the war. Continuing offered another possibility: punish Iraq more deeply, maybe destabilize Saddam, and convert defensive survival into political advantage. In the moment, that did not look like pure stubbornness from Tehran. It looked like unfinished business after enormous sacrifice. But it also lengthened the conflict and helped convert a failed short war into an 8-year war of attrition. This is the point where the region began paying a broader price. Both governments were now tying legitimacy to continuation. Both could explain to their populations why stopping looked dangerous. Both had reasons. Both also had costs they were underestimating. Once wars cross that threshold, battlefield logic and political logic fuse together. It becomes harder to ask what is militarily necessary and easier to ask what the regime can still afford to admit. The answer, in both capitals, was not peace. It was escalation under new justifications. The war widened further when it reached the Gulf. Iraq, unable to force decisive results on land, tried to pressure Iran through energy and shipping. Britannica identifies the later phase as including the tanker war, in which attacks on oil terminals, shipping, and infrastructure turned a border conflict into an international economic danger. This is one of the clearest reasons the war still matters today. Once energy routes became part of the battlefield, the audience changed. It was no longer only Baghdad and Tehran calculating risks. It was traders, insurers, exporters, importers, navies, and outside powers. The Gulf made the war global without changing its official name. That structural shift still defines the region. Military escalation in the Gulf rarely remains military. It becomes commercial, financial, and geopolitical almost immediately. Saddam did not begin the war in 1980 thinking he was writing a future script for Hormuz, but his decision helped prove a larger reality. When conflict in this region reaches oil routes, the consequences travel far faster than armies do. And the methods grew harsher as the war dragged on. Britannica notes that Iraq's arsenal in the 1980s was bolstered by substantial quantities of chemical weapons acquired or produced during the decade, and that Iraqi forces used chemical weapons against Iranian troops and later against Kurdish civilians around Halabja in March 1988. This matters not only because of the horror itself, but because of the strategic lesson it planted across the region. Long wars teach leaders what they fear lacking next time. For Iraq, that meant greater emphasis on unconventional means and weapons development. For Iran, it reinforced the view that survival could not depend on outside sympathy or conventional balance alone. Wars do not just destroy lives in the present. They rewrite what states think they need in order to avoid helplessness in the future. That is part of the legacy here. The Iran-Iraq War did not only kill and exhaust. It altered threat perception, procurement logic, and the political appetite for militarized deterrence. That legacy still sits underneath later regional decisions, including missile development, proxy strategy, and the search for strategic depth. By the later years of the war, the costs had become almost impossible to measure cleanly because they were so vast. Britannica estimates that total casualties ranged from 1 million to 2 million, with perhaps 500,000 killed and Iran suffering greater losses. It also notes that the war placed tremendous strain on both countries' resources and left a long legacy, including the proliferation of weapons programs and the later pressure that helped precipitate Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in 1990. These numbers matter because they reveal what the original 1980 decision had become. It was no longer a calculated strike for advantage, it was a regional system of loss. Men of military age were mobilized, cities were battered, budgets were redirected into destruction. Whole generations were socialized into the language of endurance, sacrifice, and unfinished war. The longer this continued, the harder compromise became. When casualties reached that scale, governments stopped treating peace as a technical option and start treating it as a narrative problem. How do you stop after that much blood and tell your population what it was for? That question became one of the main barriers to ending the conflict. Diplomacy did reappear, but too late to erase the habits of attrition. On July 20th, 1987, the UN Security Council adopted Resolution 598, calling for an immediate ceasefire, a withdrawal to internationally recognized boundaries, and steps toward settlement under UN auspices. Iraq agreed to abide by the terms if Iran would do the same. Iran did not accept immediately. That hesitation was not just stubbornness for its own sake. By then, Tehran had invested too much sacrifice and too much revolutionary meaning in continuing the war. A ceasefire was not only a military act, it was an interpretation of the previous 7 years. Accepting too early could look like admitting that all the dead had restored only what existed before the war. Still, the diplomatic mechanism now existed. The problem was that the battlefield had not yet forced both sides into the same conclusion at the same time. This is another reason turning points matter. The existence of an exit does not mean leaders are ready to take it. Institutions can open a door long before political logic allows anyone to walk through it. Then, force rewrote the meaning of diplomacy. In 1988, Iraq's military performance improved sharply. Britannica notes that Iraq recaptured the Faw Peninsula in April 1988, later regained other districts, and penetrated again into Iran. In March 1988, Iraqi chemical attacks killed thousands of Kurdish civilians in and around Halabja. Iran's position deteriorated, its economy was strained, and the cost of continuing to resist Resolution 598 rose dramatically. Under those conditions, Tehran finally accepted the UN-mediated ceasefire, and the ceasefire came into force on August 20th, 1988. On paper, that ended the war. In strategic terms, it ended far less than that. Saddam had not achieved the sweeping victory he envisioned in 1980. He had not toppled Khomeini. He had not decisively reordered the Gulf. But Iraq had survived, and survival under those conditions could be mistaken for vindication. That is the danger of ambiguous outcomes in authoritarian systems. A leader can fail in his larger design, endure the contest, and then interpret endurance as proof that the original gamble was sound enough to be tried again in some new form. So what, in the narrowest sense, did Saddam's decision achieve? It bought regime survival. Iraq was not overrun. Revolutionary Iran did not export a new order into Baghdad. Saddam remained in power. For a ruler who had launched the war partly out of fear of losing strategic ground to a neighboring revolution, those were not trivial outcomes. But the damage beneath them was severe. Iraq emerged strained, indebted, and more deeply militarized than before. Britannica explicitly links the war's tremendous strain on Iraq's resources to the later invasion of Kuwait in 1990. That connection matters because it shows how one turning point decision can remain active after the shooting stops. Wars do not end when their official ceasefires begin. They remain embedded in debt, doctrine, insecurity, and the habits leaders acquire under pressure. Saddam survived the Iran War, but he survived it with a state shaped by militarized thinking and unresolved structural problems. That was not strategic closure, it was deferred instability. And deferred instability is dangerous because it gives leaders the illusion that force still works, even when force has only pushed the bill into the future. That future arrived quickly. On August 2, 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait. Britannica states that Saddam ordered the invasion to acquire Kuwait's large oil reserves, cancel the large debt Iraq owed Kuwait, and expand Iraqi power in the region. This was not a separate drama detached from the war with Iran, it was one of its aftershocks. Iraq had spent 8 years fighting a ruinous war. It had borrowed heavily. It remained armed and politically conditioned to think in terms of coercive solutions. When Saddam looked at Kuwait, he did not see only a neighbor. He saw debt, oil, leverage, and another chance to revise a regional order by force. That is why the Iran-Iraq war still matters even when the subject appears to change. The same leadership style, the same appetite for high-risk revisionism, and the same inability to convert wartime survival into stable statecraft reappeared almost immediately. The 1980 decision did not merely cause one war, it helped normalize a mode of state behavior in Baghdad that made another war more likely. After 1991, the region kept living inside the logic the Iran-Iraq war had intensified. Sanctions, inspections, unresolved fears about weapons programs, and repeated confrontation all reinforced the lesson that vulnerability in the Middle East is rarely understood in purely local terms. States think about borders, but they also think about shipping lanes, missiles, outside intervention, economic strangulation, and the risk of being strategically isolated. That strategic imagination was not born in the 1980s, but it was hardened there. For Iran, the war deepened the conviction that survival required resilience, self-reliance, and a security posture that could not depend on goodwill from abroad. For Iraq under Saddam, the lesson was more distorted. Militarization without closure, force without durable advantage, survival interpreted as permission for further coercion. This is why the legacy of the war is not reducible to casualty numbers or border maps. It lives in the way decision-makers rank threats and design safeguards after traumatic conflict. Once a generation of leaders has seen how badly a state can bleed, they start building for the next crisis before the last one is psychologically over. Then came 2003, and the whole meaning of Iraq changed. When Saddam's regime fell, the Iraq that had once invaded Iran ceased to function as the same kind of barrier against Iranian influence. According to the Council on Foreign Relations, Iran has built considerable political clout in Iraq since Saddam's fall. More than a dozen Iraqi political parties have ties to Iran, and Tehran funds and trains paramilitary groups aligned with those parties. Some groups under the umbrella of Iraq's Popular Mobilization Forces have pledged allegiance to Iran's supreme leader. In practical terms, Iraq became something it had not been in 1980. Not just a hostile neighbor, but a political arena, a security corridor, and a field of influence. This is one of the deepest ironies in the entire story. Saddam invaded Iran in part to weaken it and protect Iraq's position. Decades later, the collapse of Saddam's regime opened conditions under which Iranian influence inside Iraq expanded dramatically. The original invasion did not directly produce that result by itself, but it belongs to the chain of decisions and consequences that made it possible. That expansion of influence matters because it changed what Iraq means in every later crisis involving Iran. If Iraq is politically penetrated, economically fragile, and threaded with Iran-linked armed actors, then any confrontation involving Tehran immediately raises questions about Iraqi stability and Iraqi sovereignty. Iraq becomes exposed not simply because of geography, but because post-2003 politics made it part of Iran's wider security environment. From Tehran's perspective, influence in Iraq helps prevent Baghdad from becoming hostile in the way it was when Iraq launched the 1980 invasion. CFR explicitly identifies that as one of Iran's major interests, preventing Baghdad from again becoming a threat and driving U.S. forces out of Iraq and the wider region. From the perspective of many Iraqis, that same influence can look like a continuing erosion of national independence. And from the perspective of outside powers, Iraq becomes the place where regional confrontation easily turns into local destabilization. This is another long aftershock of Saddam's original decision. The map stayed the same. The function of the map changed. Now the story circles back to the present. Reuters reported on March 7, 2026, that the conflict around Iran was already a week old and had suspended around a fifth of global crude and natural gas supply because of disruption linked to the Strait of Hormuz. Reuters then reported on March 8 that Iraqi oil production from its main southern fields had fallen by 70%, from about 4.3 million barrels per day to 1.3 million, because Iraq could not export through Hormuz. Iraq relies on crude sales for more than 90% of its income and nearly all public spending, and a senior Iraqi oil ministry official described the situation as the most serious operational threat Iraq had faced in more than 20 years. This is exactly why the old war still matters. Not because 1980 explains every missile, every alliance, or every command decision today. It matters because that war helped lock in a regional logic in which Iran, Iraq, Gulf shipping, energy vulnerability, and strategic fear remain tightly tied together. Once conflict around Iran reaches Hormuz, Iraq is no longer just a neighbor watching from the side. It is immediately inside the blast radius. So the strongest way to understand Saddam's decision is not as a single mistake frozen in 1980, but as the opening move in a much longer pattern. He believed he was acting before Iran consolidated. He believed speed would create leverage. He believed a controlled war could revise the regional balance in Iraq's favor. In the narrow sense, those beliefs were not absurd. In the strategic sense, they were profoundly incomplete. The invasion helped consolidate the very regime it was supposed to weaken. It helped normalize long-term militarization. It fed a broader regional reliance on coercive tools and unconventional deterrence. It strained Iraq so badly that the path to Kuwait became easier to imagine. And when Saddam finally fell, the political order that emerged in Iraq allowed Iran to build influence in ways his 1980 gamble had been meant to prevent. That is why the decision still deserves careful study. It did not simply fail or succeed. It rearranged incentives. And history is often shaped less by clean victories than by the incentives left behind after ambiguous outcomes. There is also a broader lesson in how this war stayed alive after it ended. Border wars are often remembered as if they remain trapped in maps and ceasefire lines. But some wars escape the front. They move into finance, alliance structures, political memory, military doctrine, and energy infrastructure. The Iran-Iraq War did all of that. It left behind casualties on an immense scale, but it also left behind habits, suspicion of vulnerability, fear of encirclement, faith in deterrence, and a willingness to think of oil routes as strategic pressure points rather than neutral commercial space. When a later crisis erupts around Iran and Hormuz, the region is not reacting from a blank slate. It is reacting through institutions and instincts shaped partly by the 1980 to 1988 war. That is why viewers looking only at today's headlines can miss the deeper continuity. The present crisis feels immediate because it is, but it also carries the weight of older decisions that still structure what leaders fear, what they protect first, and what they are prepared to risk. So what did Saddam Hussein's turning point decision achieve in the short term? It allowed Iraq to strike first, seize initiative, and prevent revolutionary Iran from converting its early upheaval into an easy strategic gain against Baghdad. Iraq survived. Saddam stayed in power. Iran did not impose a new order on Iraq. Those were real outcomes, and serious analysis has to acknowledge them. But what did the decision damage? Almost everything around those outcomes. It turned a tense frontier into an 8-year catastrophe. It helped entrench militarization on both sides. It strengthened the IRGC inside Iran. It deepened Iraq's structural strain. It fed the logic that later led to Kuwait in 1990. And in the longer arc, after 2003, it became part of the chain of events that left Iraq more exposed to Iranian influence than the 1980 invasion had ever intended. Today, when a war around Iran disrupts Hormuz, crushes Iraqi oil output, and sends shockwaves through the region, that old decision is still present in the architecture of the crisis. That was the price. Lives, wealth, stability, strategic flexibility, and future room to maneuver were traded away to buy short-term leverage in a moment of perceived opportunity. And once those things are traded away, later generations inherit the bill. The deeper lesson is not that history is simple, or that one side was entirely right and the other entirely wrong. It is that powerful leaders often make decisions inside real constraints, with real fears, and with logic that can sound persuasive in the room. But when they choose force to revise an unstable system, the system rarely breaks cleanly. It mutates. It carries the decision forward into places the original decision-maker never fully controlled. That mutation is part of history too. Today we have traced how one decision in Baghdad did not merely start a war. It helped shape the strategic behavior of states, the vulnerability of oil routes, the political fragility of Iraq, and the wider fears that still surround Iran and the Middle East now. However anyone judges that choice, and whatever benefits or costs they emphasize, it remains part of the history the region still lives inside. If you found this episode valuable, please like the video. It helps Rooms Where History reach viewers who want serious, evidence-minded storytelling rather than noise. Subscribe if you value calm analysis of the decisions that redirected nations and could not be easily walked back. And leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from and which historical turning point you believe still shapes the present the most. Thank you for watching, and thank you for helping keep these histories alive.